And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Ann Reed. She's a member of our class of 2017. Like we said, she's one of our help desk stalwarts, and she has also been a teacher for, she tells me, 43 years. So I know we are in good hands this morning. Ann, take it away.
All right, thanks, Leslie. Thanks, Kirsten. If you're as bummed out with the rainy weather and the daily news, I want you to kind of put yourself into a 90-minute respite this morning, and let's dig our hands and mind into some, what I'd call some virtual dirt. So we will take some time to do that. Welcome. And I do want to tell you a little bit about the presentation before we begin, for sure. The presentation has about 10 sections. Outdoor container gardening is simple, but to do things correctly, it does involve having some background knowledge. And we will go through what you need to know today. The presentation, the overview, and these are the things we're going to touch on. We're going to talk about a rationale for container gardening, outdoor container gardening for a moment. And then we're going to dig into the issue with containers themselves. From there, we'll discuss your growing medium, watering, fertilizing, plant selection and tips on plant selection, pollination, potting procedure, care basics, and just a little bit about overwintering pots. So we have a lot to do this morning. We'll take a few breaks for questions, but we are going to get started. Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia is an incredible group of people. I have been working with this group for several years, and they continually amaze me and inspire me. Our subject matter today is exploring how to select pots, how to do plants, and the care for outdoor containers. So let's take a look at the services provided by the Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia since 1985. Leslie's mentioned the help desk. We have farmers market, plant clinics, classes, demonstration gardens, a plant clinic at Arlington Central Library, a plant clinic at Beatley Library at Alexandria, and we have the neighborhood seed distribution that is going on now. I won't go into details about these public services, but you can get those details from the website www.mgnb.org. When you do your own research, just a word of caution, put in the topic and put in the phrase site, SITE:/EDU, and you will be taken to websites that are research-based university or educational websites. And these resources give you facts and not opinions. So you'll want to access those particular websites. All right. The information that I'm going to share with you today is based on current horticultural best practices and research through the Virginia Cooperative Extension and also through other state extension services. Our premise this morning is that with appropriate containers and proper handling, anything that you can grow in the ground can also be grown in a container. So we'll go with that premise. You will hear me repeat some certain information in a different context. And this is necessary because its significance changes depending on the differing task. So know that that will occur. All right, we're going to talk a few minutes about why container gardening. Why are you choosing to garden with containers and pots? Why are you here this morning? What do you want to learn? In working with audiences, these are some of the things that they offered in terms of why they wanted to begin or continue container gardening in an effective way. One of the reasons is just to have fun. And particularly that is appropriate in current events in our country today. Um, Growing ornamental and edible plants is a lot of fun if you know some basic information. Easy startup. Easy in that you don't have to till or hoe or do any of those types of things. So basically, it's an easy startup. One of the things that I found so encouraging about container gardening is that it's a confidence builder. For those of you who say to yourself, I just about kill every plant I put in the ground or whatever, container gardening will help you build your confidence because it's an easier type of gardening. Decorations. You can add containers for decorative appeal on curbside, in front of your house, window views, patios, decks. There's so many locations that would benefit from that decorative complement. And we're going to mention edibles throughout the conversation this morning. My advice to you is that when you have edible pots, put them near places that are convenient, outside your deck at an entrance so you can access those edibles easily. So think about, why container gardening, why are you here and what do you want to learn? Determine your purpose. There are lots of reasons that people engage in container gardening, but what you want to do is decide what you want to accomplish in your garden. Do you want to have a focal point in your garden, in your landscape, your patio, your deck, your porch? Do you have a particular theme that you're interested in? Those could be seasonal themes, fragrance, color, children's gardens. There's so many options. Aesthetics is another important piece of container gardening. It's not only the plants, but people like to have pretty containers. So that is one thing that is a purpose you could have. Herb, fruit, and vegetable gardening is always a plus with containers. Attracting wildlife. One of the things we'll talk about this morning is the use of native plants in your containers. And those plants should be those that host pollinators, and pollinators are our friends, of course. Privacy. If you live in an area where your deck or your patio is very in close proximity to some other residence, you can actually use containers with trellises to build a privacy kind of fence that's very attractive. You can do a combination of things. So you do want to think about your purpose. I began container gardening many years ago and it was fairly random. But if you determine your purpose, you can have a reason to buy certain containers and you can watch your budget as well. Other people like to have a look for each season. That might be a purpose you have, particularly if you don't have many containers. In the springtime, you could plant bulbs or pansies. In summer, you can put in your tropicals, things like daisies or zinnias. In the fall, that's my favorite time to experiment with things. I love to plant orange and maroon mums and kale and put gourds in my pots. So fall is a very wonderful time to continue your containers, and you can do it in the wintertime. You just plant some type of evergreen or use evergreen boughs and add complementary types of foliage to it, like Ilex verticillata. So you want to make sure that you enjoy those particular opportunities. Some people just want to have like a permanent central plant that might be an evergreen and then put seasonal plants around it. So purpose is something that you do need to think about and plan for. I won't have to twist your arm about the growing advantages of container gardening. First of all, container gardening has broad appeal. Kids love to do containers. They just love it. I have a granddaughter who loves to help me plant the containers, and she's 10 now, and she knows more about it. So she feels like that she's learning at the same time that she's enjoying having fun and will be able to eat those tomatoes later. People with physical limitations really benefit from container gardening for obvious reasons. So if you have some physical limitations, then consider container gardening. New gardeners, and that's what I was when I first started container gardening, new gardeners, novice gardeners, learn a lot through container gardening, and of course, over time, probably switch over or do both types of gardening. Gardeners wanting to downsize, to save space, container gardening is for you. Saving time, it does help you save time. You don't have as much to do with container gardening. No digging or tilling, doesn't that sound wonderful? Less work, but at the same time, let me share with you another research-based fact about digging and tilling. Tilling actually disturbs soil structure and can damage healthy soil fungi. So if you use containers, you're not disturbing soil structure and you're not disturbing the fungi that the plants need for root health. Weed-free, I would say generally that is correct, weed-free, and one of the reasons is because you have compactness in your planters and there's not much room for any weeds for that matter. Inexpensive to start up is you can, and I'm guilty of this, you can spend money on containers for sure, and you can spend money on a lot of plants. But inexpensive startup might involve your using seeds, which are absolutely free if you get them from the Virginia Cooperative Extension Program. And you can also, lower your expectations, get a few containers, start small, and just go from there. Overcome typical garden problems. This is a biggie. When you don't have enough sun, like it's too shady, you can overcome that garden problem, and we will talk more about that as we get into our topic more. Poor quality soil. There are different kinds of soil you can use, but definitely you have control over those garden problems. Persistent soil-borne diseases are easy to control more if that occurs or doesn't usually occur. And then you can extend your growing season, the harvest season of many tender vegetables for several weeks by covering up your plants or moving them indoors when frost threatens. And some crops can even be carried through the winter indoors if you have adequate light. So these are a few growing advantages and a few more. Temporary or permanent. You can make your plants temporary or permanent in these containers. They can be fitted in any location depending on the size and the space that you have. Convenience, locate your containers for ease of care. And that means, right there on that deck, right there on that patio, right there, at your doorstep. Growing conditions. You'll hear a lot about the optimum growing conditions for containers today. Water, sunlight, nutrients. You have better control over water access, moving your plants to sunlight, and the nutrients that they need if they're in containers. It's easier to protect your plants from things like extreme weather conditions, insect pests, and even bigger critters like rabbits and deer. So easier to take care of your plant. And finally, one advantage is vertical growth options. If you see in the picture, using vertical structures save space, and you also can use exterior walls to save space and to use as a type of structure that the plants can rely on. All right, so these are just a few introductory ideas about the rationale for having a container garden as opposed to an in-ground garden. So I'd like to stop just a moment and see if there are any questions, Leslie.
Yep, and okay, well, we've had a couple questions. Some of them are on specific plants that we're going to cover later. someone was asking about, let's see, hang on, let me find it. They're looking for a recommendation on native plants that can fit.
Is a form that has to be filled out. It's called a free seed distribution form and sent in. And another master gardener is in charge of that form and will forward it to a contact person in Alexandria, North Arlington, and South Arlington. I'm the South Arlington contact person. And so you do have to fill out a form request online, and then we'll go from there. So it'll take a few days to process it.
Thanks, Ann.
Right.
Just a couple follow-ups. Somebody was asking about the best types of containers, and I know you're going to get to that soon.
Oh, yeah.
Let's see. Yes, there's some back and forth talk about where you can get native plants too. So why don't we go ahead and continue at this point, and we'll take another break soon for questions.
Okay, thank you, Leslie. Appreciate that. Okay, all right, everyone. Outdoor container gardening is a culture, and you can make it as simple as you want. You can make it as complicated as you want, depending on the plants and containers you use. But a successful and simple approach that can be the basis of your container gardening focuses on 7 areas to develop your containers. If you pay attention to these 7 areas, these 7 requirements, you should experience success with as little or as much time or labor as you can provide. So we're going to talk for a few minutes everything you need to know about containers. If you have questions about containers, I hope that I will answer them there. Growing medium has to do with choosing bag soil as opposed to soilless mix. The condition with watering is probably the biggest problem with container gardening, because people either overwater or underwater. So we'll talk about that. Fertilizing is another issue. Plant selection, right plant, right place, general maintenance and care, and overwintering. If you know the basics of these 7 requirements, then you should be very successful container gardening. So gardeners, so let's take a look first at a concept that I want you to consider. All right. Right plant, right pot. Now think back about your experiences with going to buy pots. I think back of mine, and I think back about the fact that I wanted to find a pretty pot. I know it had to have a hole in it, but I didn't really think about anything more than I wanted it to be pretty and where I wanted to put it and what I wanted to put in it. And that was about, and of course, I needed to get some soil. Design elements are important with pots. It is. That's one of the reasons you do it, because you want the plant to be beautiful, to enhance the location of where you place it. But I do want you to consider that pots in and of themselves have significant impact on the growth and health of your plant. So the pot that you select for a plant that you're going to use in that pot need to have some compatibility, because if you have the wrong pot with a plant, it can be detrimental to its growth. So we're going to dig into some of those issues now. All right, here are your container basics. On the left, you will see a photograph of one of my terracotta pots. I dug it out the other day. We store them in a shed. And lo and behold, what did I see on the rim of the pot was a salt deposit. So one of the things I want to share with you this morning is that the first thing that you need to do is to clean your containers. I recommend cleaning them in early spring before you start setting up your pots. Because if you store them over fall, I'm not sure they'll be very clean depending on where you store them. So you want to use clean containers. All you need is to make sure that you clean it with soap and water. Overwintered containers can harbor insect eggs, larvae, and salt deposits. So scrubbing the containers with hot soapy water and rinsing them well lowers the likelihood of insect hatch disease or alkaline deposits in your soil. So cleaning them is your first step. All right, plant size determines the dimensions. With dimensions, the biggest thing that I want you to think about is the fact that you have to be mindful of the root structure for your selected plants. Does it have deep roots? Then that's knowledge that you need to have to determine the dimensions of the size of your container. Most horticulturists will say to you that 6 to 8 inches is adequate for root development of most plants. It's an adequate number of depth. So you can go with that, but as we'll talk more about vegetables, tomatoes have a longer, deeper root structure, and therefore they need to have a pot with much more depth than that. So again, we will talk more about that as we get to the vegetables. Drainage hole is required. Now I know that seems to be simplistic, but if you've ever shopped for pots, some of the most beautiful ones have no holes. And I have made the mistake of not looking for the hole in the past. And my husband, after I bought that expensive pot, I didn't take it back. He put a hole in it. So to always double check. Some of them are decorative and you put another pot inside of them. If you're planning to use that pot to put the soil in, then you need a drainage hole. One drainage hole is necessary, but you could use more, depends. And then what you want to do is you want to cover that drainage hole with some mesh or screen. I use a coffee filter over the hole for a particular purpose, and that purpose is to retain the soil so the nutrients don't drain out as quickly. We'll talk more about using other kinds of porous covers for that hole later. You have to be really careful about the kind of material that you put over the hole to retain the soil. Larger objects in general can block drainage, and when you're blocking the drainage, then you're taking the chance of developing root rot with your plant. With edibles, edibles require more support. They also, you want to avoid little soil spillage. And also you want to have, make sure that you don't use pots that have ever had any toxic products in them. So with your veggies, you need to know the height of your fully grown plant, and you need to know the root depth when selecting your pot. Now, generally speaking, the tags that you have in plants when you purchase them will give you information about their height, not necessarily the depth. So you want to make sure that you check that out by finding out online or in some books about the necessary root depth. The soil spillage is a problem because if it runs off the top, you are losing nutrients in the top of your pot as well as through the drainage hole. So you want to be careful about that. And to repeat, no toxic product should ever have been in the container that you're using. Porous containers dry out faster than glazed or plastic, and we'll talk more about materials that containers are made of shortly. But if you want to not worry so much about watering, then you'll select those plastic or glazed containers to save yourself time and to save water. Okay, so those are just some general container basics. Here are some other thoughts. Placement of your plants is important. Ask yourself, am I going to hang some of these plants in the air? And if you do hang plants in the air, a few things you have to think about extra. First of all, you're going to have to water it more often because wind and reflected heat causes those plants to dry out faster. Another thing is they drip. And particularly if you're in like a high-rise structure or building, you want to be mindful of whether this drip is going to be on other people's possessions or your own, or on people themselves, so the ones below. Also, you want to practice safety with hanging them in the air. You want to secure them very carefully and consider potential safety issues at all times with that. Another thing has to do with sun exposure and soil temperature fluctuations. So will the materials, size, or color result in any fluctuating temperatures? Because the fluctuating soil temperatures will definitely cause problems with your roots. So things just to consider is metal causes high fluctuations. So if you have metal containers, that will definitely affect your soil temperatures. Dark colored pots absorb more heat, causing root damage, and the medium dries out, the soil will dry out. Smaller pots are always, if they're in the sun, dry out much faster than larger pots. If fluctuating temperatures are a concern under these conditions, then you can protect the roots from extremes of heat and cold by insulating the pot. And one way to do that is double potting, and we will talk a little bit more about that. Other placement considerations are where, what about the sun, what about water, what about something called microclimates. Obviously, it's wherever you want to put these pots, but these are just some places: driveways, sidewalks, window boxes, hanging basket, decks, porch, balconies, many places. One thing you want to consider about balconies and decks and porches is the weight limits. Those of you who live in condominium complexes, high-rise apartments, weight limits sometimes on balconies and porches and decks are driven by HOAs. And an example of an issue that could occur is if you have a 20-inch container filled with some moist growing medium, it may weigh over 100 pounds. And so you have to consider this in areas and locations and in housing where there are weight limits. Sunlight. A couple of things about sunlight. You know, when you purchase plants, there's a little tag and it tells you full sun or part shade. And sometimes people don't know what that exactly means. So here's the skinny on that. Full sun means your plant needs 6 to 8 hours of sunlight. It's part sun, it's around 4 to 6. Part shade is 2 to 4, and full shade is 0 to 2. Now, I had a question at the help desk about a week ago where a person was saying that they wanted to grow tomatoes, but they didn't have 6 to 8 or more hours, which tomatoes need in order to produce well. And so what I told her is research-based fact. This does not, the hours that you have your plants in sun do not have to be consecutive. And with container gardening, if you have your pot or container on casters or rollers, you can roll that pot around and figure that out. You just have to decide, know your space, know your location, and be able to time the sunlight. So it's not necessarily consecutive. So it's possible to grow tomatoes with less than 6 to 8 hours, fewer than 6 to 8 hours. But at the same time, you might not get the productivity that you want, but you'll get tomatoes. Sun location, these are just basic facts. South facing is best because you get 6 to 8 hours. West facing is next with 5 to 6 hours, and east facing 4 to 5 hours. So again, know your location. Let's talk a little bit about microclimates. Microclimates are the environment that surrounds the plant. And microclimates can both negatively and positively affect your plant. We'll talk more about that, but just consider the following. If your plant is located on or around brick, stone, and concrete, the heat radiates at night, okay? If it's located near glass and metal, they reflect light and heat. Building walls and shade, of course, will have cooling effects. And if you're particularly in high rises, wind tunnels, one of the recommendations I have for that is to group your pots so they can protect one another. You can plant hardier pots as a windbreak. You can put up screens. But microclimates are something to be very much aware about with container gardening, and we'll go more and more into that as we dig deeper, so to speak. All right, more container considerations. Drainage we've talked about, colors we've mentioned. I want to spend some time on porosity. Porosity is the permeability of your container. It has something to do related not only with water, but also the ability of air to move through these tiny pockets or spaces in the container material. Porosity is a very big factor in terms of the kind of plant that you put in a specific kind of pot. If the material is porous, like clay and terracotta, it will absorb water from the planting medium. Thus, the plant roots are in danger of drying out, and that for you has implications for careful watering and overwintering. Porous materials lose water faster than non-porous, like plastic is non-porous, so you consider that. Things like wire baskets with absorbent material and peat pots absorb water from planting media. So you want to consider this porosity is a big deal. Vegetables, deep root vegetables like tomatoes must have 1 to 2 feet deep pots, and that has to do, of course, with the root depth that they have in terms of producing properly. If you're going to consider numbers of plantings, it's recommended that 3 to 4 plants are in 10 to 12 inch pot, 4 to 6 plants, 14 to 6 inch pot, and 6 to 8 plants in a 16 to 20 inch pot. Now that's a pretty compact situation. I don't normally put that many plants in a pot, but if it's a large pot, you can get away with that depending on the size of the plants themselves. Okay. A few more container considerations. First of all, will the material rot? Now, I know that sounds kind of a strange type of thing, but lots of people use lumber or wood of some sort to build containers. The thing that I would ask you to think about with that is that treated lumber is not what you want to use for any containers that you grow food in. And this is because of the possibility of some of this lumber, even though it's not as prevalent as it was, to have some kind of chemicals in it so that it will resist rotting. I would recommend, if you want to choose wood, to choose things like that are resistant to decay, such as cedar or redwood. And always consider the weight of your containers. If the container is going to be heavy and difficult to move, I recommend, and we'll talk more about this, placing it on a dolly with casters. And this is wonderful if you want to rotate your plant to take advantage of light or move it to a protected place during bad weather. Or you could just leave it in one spot. Double potting is an interesting phenomenon, and it can insulate your plants. It also can help with weight. So what it basically is it's like a big pot with a pot liner inside. Often it's just a little plastic pot, and the big pot itself is decorative. What you do is you slip the smaller pot liner in and or out without disturbing any of the roots. And the only thing that you have to be careful about with double potting is you do not want your pot inside to be in standing water, because that will contribute to root rot. Double potting aids in pot rotation. It helps for heat absorption to avoid that problem, facilitates transplanting, and it can aid overwintering by, of course, providing some kind of buffer from the winter. So double potting is one way to achieve certain things that putting it in a single pot cannot necessarily do. Container types. This is one of my favorite things, is to explore the different kinds of containers. I never get tired of looking for different types of sources. You know, your containers can be temporary, permanent, they can be practical, they can be artistic, they can be expensive, they can be free, they can be whimsical, and I love the whimsical. Your sources that you will get them, obviously, are from garden centers or online sources, but honestly, my favorite place to get potential containers, and my husband started this is the side of the road. So if you look at some of the pictures, obviously you see a whiskey barrel with all these different types of plants, a grocery cart that looks like it has peat moss in it, and a swimming pool with, it looks like vegetables, you know, that have vertical structures with them. So just being creative is wonderful, and you can do that as long as you know what your plant needs and have researched that information. You want to be careful about recycled or transformed materials. There are lots of different kinds of them. There's plastic buckets that I've grown tomatoes in. People use wooden crates, wading pools, as you see there at the bottom again, trash bag, plastic food containers. There's no end to it, especially if you want to be environment friendly. Treated lumber caution, we've talked about. One thing that you want to be careful about is that if you use types of materials that are plastic, you want to make sure that they are intended for outdoor use. Otherwise, they will get brittle and not work well for you. Okay, so let's think about what you want to plant as we dig deeper into pot selection. All right, so if you are concerned about making sure you've chosen the right kind of pot for your plant, this is what we're going to be doing for a few minutes, is getting into the details of the right pot in terms of what your plant needs. So know your pot. If you want clay pots, here are the things that you will find will be helpful to know. Clay pots are very porous. They're breathed so that your plants have, you know, lots of oxygen and so on. And this increase of airflow is very good because it deters bad fungal growth. Know that clay pots also absorb water, which means they dry out much quicker and easier, which is, of course, a watering habit concern you will have to be aware of. Ceramic coated clay does it a little bit better because they retain water better, okay, with it ceramic coated. If you want to grow edibles in clay, what you're doing is choosing edibles that thrive in a drier soil. And those edibles that thrive in a drier soil are thyme, oregano, rosemary, beans, and okra, for a few well-known examples. So using clay pots, you want to select plants that enjoy drier environments. Okay, how about plastic pots? I like to call plastic the plastic power pots. I love the aesthetics of your clay pots, but the plastic is very, very, it's got a lot of good advantages. So let's take a look at some of the concerns and good things about plastic. All right, plastic, the variety is unlimited. That's one of the advantages of plastic pots, is that they are available in a huge variety of shapes, sizes, colors, and textures, and you can find some that have incredibly whimsical designs on them as well. So the variety. Plastic retains water much more than clay. So the water retention is more than clay, and this makes them ideal choice for plants that thrive in a moist soil. Or if you're like me, you forget to water sometimes, it's not the end of the world. Plastic pots have no porosity. Durability. Our newer plastic pots are really tough. They're durable They virtually unbreakable. They rarely chip or crack. They withstand those freeze and thaw cycles. So they're very durable. Lightweight. If you like to move your plants from place to place, plastic pots are for you. Plastic's lighter, and even larger pots can be easily relocated. Price. The pros of plastic pots include a reasonable price. You can find some that are expensive, but you can also find many kinds of varieties that are reasonable. High quality plastic pots even can save you a few dollars, because clay pots, are relatively expensive. Recyclability. As gardeners, we are concerned about our impact on the environment, especially with single plastic use. So today's higher quality plastic pots are usually recyclable. And if you're not sure, flip them over to the bottom and there'll be information about its recyclability, if that's something that then you should be concerned about. Okay, so is it plastic that you are in love with as a pot? Metal. Big thing about metal is that metal pots absorb and intensify heat, obviously. You can use them with tropicals, like palms, banana plants, sun-loving perennials, and certain edibles absolutely thrive in galvanized metal pots. Watermelons, sweet potatoes, and hot peppers love them, okay? So would you have a plant that you think that you would use for a galvanized metal one? Going to some trendy things, let's talk about self-watering containers. First of all, I know about them, but I've never used them before. So I had to do, some thinking and research about this one. I have friends that swear by them, that they wouldn't, their pots would die without them. So, their plants would die without them. They work by capillary action or wicking. So when the soil starts to dry out, the water in the reservoir wicks up through the soil and begins to hydrate it. And many self-watering planters can go 2 to 3 weeks without having that little reservoir filled. And of course, that can depend on the environment, the type of plant, the humidity, the size of the plant. Those are determining factors, but that's pretty extensive, 2 to 3 weeks. One of the issues with, self-watering pots is you want to avoid liquid and time-release fertilizers, because this tends to contribute to salt buildup in the container itself. So you use a granular fertilizer and you use it worked into the soil. Obviously, you don't put it in a reservoir, but this will help keep the salt content down in your self-watering pots. These are great if you're going to be gone a long time, absent from any, type. You can anticipate some kind of absence from your plants. It's convenient for a busy gardener, and there are some fabulous YouTube videos out there about DIY, do-it-yourself self-watering pots. These pots are especially recommended for edibles that like evenly moist soil. And those edibles are things like tomatoes, basil, squash, and broccoli. So, if you're a busy person, this may be something that you can use and benefit from. All right, grow bags. I myself have never used them. I know people that have, and some of those people love them, and some of them have used them once and did not use them again. So you want to take a look at the advantages and disadvantages of your grow bags. Let's look at the disadvantages first. Durability. Grow bags do not last quite as long as last nearly as long as hard-body containers. The fabric pots, usually the fabric for the pots lasts maybe 2 to 3 growing seasons. And of course, this it also varies based on environmental conditions and the overall quality of the bag that you purchased. So durability is kind of iffy, 2 to 3 seasons. The cost, well, you will be replacing them more often than pots. So you want to consider that as whether that's cost effective or not. The costs vary depending on the capacity of the bag and where you get it from, where you purchase it from. But a 5-gallon bag usually costs around $6 on up. So if you're replacing the bag every 2 to 3 years, that's a pretty big investment. Aesthetics. Well, obviously grow bags aren't as pretty or as chic as ceramic or terracotta bags, terracotta pots, excuse me. They usually are in solid colors like white or gray or black. They don't have any kind of designer motifs or any kind of patterns on them. You know, hard body pots usually have that kind of advantage, kind of aesthetics. So to put it bluntly, they do look like a bag or a sack. So aesthetics, if that's an issue, you might not enjoy using these. Environmental concerns, grow bags, not all of them on the market are eco-friendly because they are not all biodegradable. And this can become a concern because you do discard and replace them more often. Grow bags are very water consumptive. They are quite porous. And if there's any big downside for using grow bags, it is the fact that you have to water them a lot. The water, because they're so porous, the water just wicks out. So you're going to have to water them more often. On the other hand, you won't have any overwatering problems because they excess water wicks out of them very quickly. Mobility. Some people say they're pretty mobile, but that isn't always the case, particularly if you have some that are over 20 gallons. They're very difficult to move once they're planted because they don't have sturdy walls. They don't have structured types of strength like traditional pots. And in some cases, the handles are prone to tearing. So you have to consider that. On the advantage side, probably 2 ones speak to me. One, the compact storage. You dump them out, clean them out, and you just pack them up, put them away. The other is that because of their high porosity, there's plenty of aeration and O2 for root growth in those pots. There are others for space constraints. They are good for people. You can move them around if they're not too big and heavy, and so on. So again, grow bags are not for everyone, but they might be just for you. Okay. All right. Do we want to stop here and see if anybody has any questions, Leslie?
Yes, you have lots of questions.
Oh.
Lots of questions. So we had a couple people asking about either pots made out of cement or fiber that looks like cement, or using things like tires for holding plantings.
Yeah, those are all possible, but again, the concrete is in the same category as clay and terracotta. Tends to be porous, and so you'll have to water those a little bit more. And what was the other one?
A tire.
Oh, a tire. Yeah, those are possible. Tires can be used. I'm not sure how you would construct that because I've seen pictures of the plants inside the walls of the tire, flowing out and trailing. And so my concern there would be to make sure you have plenty of holes so that the water would drain out. I guess it's possible, but to me, it has some drawbacks in terms of making sure you have enough aeration, because that kind of rubber, whatever it is, gets hot.
Right.
So you want to be careful about the heat concerns if you have those in direct sun, I would think.
Okay. We had a couple questions about window boxes. A lot of them seem to have like a plastic lining in them.
Yeah.
Which, do you have recommendations? Would you recommend removing plastic linings, or because how does it deal with drainage then?
Well, that's a good question. Um, somewhere there needs to be drainage, and if I in my particular wooden boxes that I had on my deck, I did not use plastic. I had holes in the bottom of them. Now, and of course, I had to water them a little more frequently because of that.
Mm-hmm.
But I chose to not use the plastic because I was concerned about the flow of the water and the access to air, because that was like another layer for me. So I tend to avoid using things like that because it tends to sort of suffocate your roots, sort of create an oxygen problem. So I would take them out. That would be what I would do.
Okay. And then we had a question about planting plants that can escape into the wild or are somewhat invasive in pots. Do you think that, and even putting those pots into the ground, is that enough to contain them? Or do you feel like they can still escape if they're, even if it's in a pot, but it's potted in the ground for more aggressive plants?
All right. So we're talking about invasives like maybe mints or something like that.
Or ivy or, yeah.
Okay. Well, it depends on the plant is what I would say to that. Something that seeds out very easily, like mints and things that flower and seed, those will, they're going to flower and seed no matter where you put them. I mean, you can control the root spread, but if they seed out, then you're not going to be able to control that. With ivy, I would say the best place for ivy is in a pot. If you're going to grow something like that as a trailer, just keep it cut back from crawling up a tree or something like that. That would be a practical approach.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on. A lot of the other questions are things I think you're going to address, including one: do we need to dump out soil from last year's pot or planter? So I think you're going to address that.
Yes, yes. All right. Thank you. Thanks for the questions. Okay, let's take a look at growing medium. There are actually two kinds of, unless you make your own, there are really two kinds of growing medium that we're going to talk about. One is your soilless mix, and the other is your bagged soil-based mixes. I guess if I had to say it once, I'd say it 5 or 6 times, is to research the soil requirements of your plantings. Some plants will not do well in soilless mixes. Some plants do fine in soilless mixes. So know the kind of soil that your plant loves to live in. So know your plant. All right, a little side note before we get into a lot about soil. For the longest time, I knew the words vermiculite and perlite, but I just knew they were in the soil to help with water or something. But there is a definite difference between vermiculite and perlite, and so I want to share that with you for just a moment. Vermiculite retains more water and for longer periods. Vermiculite retains more water and for longer periods. As a result, it offers less aeration with the oxygen flow. Perlite retains less water, but it drains excess water off better and thereby enhances aeration. You can look on any kind of bagged soil and see, or other medium, you can see whether it has vermiculite, perlite, or a little bit of both in it. You want to make sure you realize, though, and this is there on the left, that if you have excessive vermiculite, for example, if you add that to some of your medium, if you have excessive vermiculite, this can absorb moisture away from root hairs of your plant, and they can die because they're just thirsting for the water, and that vermiculite is taking it away from the root hairs. So vermiculite and perlite are something to at least be aware of. All right, let's talk first of all about soilless mix. This kind of mix contains peat moss and additives like perlite or vermiculite. But the thing that soilless mixes don't have is nutrients. They have no nutrients in them because they're sterile with no bacteria or fungi that's found in real soil. This has an impact on vegetables. Since it lacks nutrients, you don't use soilless mixes with veggies, okay? It's also very light, and lightweight can be good for things like hanging baskets, but it's too light to support plant roots that particularly are deep into the pot. Soilless mix dries out quickly, so you have to water it more frequently. The one thing that you can use soilless mix for that will thrive and be fine is it is fine for annuals as opposed to perennials. It's fine for those, okay? The bag soils are mixes are made up of sterilized garden loam that has additives such as peat, sand, bark chips, vermiculite to retain the moisture. It does contain, most of the time, nutrients, some fertilizer, the vitamins. It provides stability for the plant. It's not as light, so it provides stability for your plant and its roots. It retains water and nutrients better than soilless mix. And if you're going to have a plant in a container for an extended period of time, it is your better choice, the bag soil mix. In terms of putting the soil into your pot, you want to leave ample room to water thoroughly without soil runoff. So you add the medium to about 1 to 2 inches from the rim of your container. And that way you will avoid less runoff and therefore less loss of nutrients from the soil. Garden soil, not many people, I've had people ask me if they could use, ground soil out of the gardens that in their yard. And I would say that I would not do it. And the reason is because your potential there to introduce disease and pests is great from garden soil, okay? The other issue with using garden soil is that it's very thick, much thicker than bagged potting soil. So the drainage in it is going to be very poor. This is a formula for do-it-yourself mix. I do not do this, but I do some kinds of mixing, but not totally from scratch. You can do whatever parts, you have to decide the parts, and you can look this up. You could do, so many parts of peat, and so many parts of garden loam, perlite, slow release fertilizer. Those are the kinds of things that you would put into a DIY mix. But of course, packaged potting soil is fairly cheap, and all of that is done for you. So it just depends on how creative a gardener you want to be. Okay. All right. Let's go on to watering basics. Okay, some really important issues. Irrigate early in the morning. Why? Because as the day rolls on in the summertime, that sun gets overhead, it's hot, hot, hot toward the afternoon. And so if you water in the afternoon, that hot sun is going to cause you to lose your water much quicker. If you water in the morning, it minimizes your evaporation losses. Also, watering in the morning minimizes the evaporation or effects of wind on water. That wind usually occurs later in the day. Another thing is that watering in the morning reduces leaf wetness because you have all day long to let that leaf wetness, anything water that dropped on your leaves can evaporate, and this will reduce it so you can avoid leaf damage and not promote disease. Watering daily or twice daily may be needed. You want to, particularly during excessive heat events, to check your plants daily, and on windy days to do it as well. I tell clients that the finger test is to press your finger into the soil up to your second knuckle. You know, if the soil is dry when you have it to that depth, then you need to water. The finger test is the simplest way to go. Another way to help preserve water is to put about 1/4 of an inch of mulch on the top of a container, and this can reduce the water requirements of your plant. For windbreaks, you can group plants together. Some people put some small fencing or wind screens near or around their plants because wind can definitely dry it out as well. Apply water toward the roots until it drains out the drainage hole. You want to avoid extensive overhead watering. This creates problems for your plant in terms of the leaf evaporation, the water from the leaf evaporating, and it also creates problems of the water getting to the roots. So as you see in the picture, the person is holding the water pail so that it's being watered down at the bottom of the plant, and that is for the proper place to water it so that it will avoid any problems with evaporation. Use of saucers. Seems like a good idea to use saucers to capture water, and it is, but you need to monitor it, because if the saucers are in direct contact with the container, then those standing pools of water, if this goes on for days, standing pools can contribute to root rot within the container pot. Another issue is to avoid standing or soggy water on top. You don't want the top to sit in water either, and because this can cause root rot because it prevents the aeration in the soil. Last thing is water absorbing polymers. I think they're called hydrogels, and I have not used them, but they're non-toxic water retention soil additives. They look like sugar and they fill up and they act like sponges in the soil, and they absorb water when it comes by, and then they later make it available to plants. Most horticulturists are saying that the judgment is out on their long-term benefits. So you be the judge of what you would do. I have not used them, but most folks will tell you that, yeah, they might work, but not any big deal. It hasn't shown that much of a big deal. Okay. All right. Fertilizing basics. Container plants need fertilizing more than in-ground plants. The reason for this is because the necessity of your having to water more frequently so that you want your soil to be very well drained to avoid root rot. As you water, you are at the same time flushing essential nutrients from the growing medium very quickly. So you want to monitor your plants for possible signs of nutrient deficiency with containers. That needs to happen pretty frequently. Such things as leaf yellowing, browning, stunted growth, poor flowering or fruiting. These are all signs of that particular problem. Slow release fertilizer is the easiest thing to use to provide additional nutrients. It does what it says. The nutrients are added slowly after each irrigation of your plants. Using slow release eliminates what we call fertilizer burn. It stays in the soil longer, And for the most part, it has the same NPK rating, which is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So generally speaking, I've asked the help desk gurus about, what's the best combination of NPK to use on certain things. Generally speaking, they'll say 10, 10, 10 or 14, 14, 14, but there are some caveats. So if you have flowering or fruiting plants, make sure that your NPK rating on your fertilizer has a little bit higher phosphorus rating, so that will enhance the flowering and fruiting of your plants. And if you're growing vegetables, make sure that your slow release has calcium and magnesium included in the product. And by all means, follow product recommendations with fertilizer. Over fertilizing your plants is just as bad as under fertilizing them. If you over fertilize, what happens is your lower leaves begin yellowing and wilting. There's browning of your leaf margins and tips. Your roots start rotting. They get black and brown. There's hardly any growth or very little. Sometimes you get leaf drop. And there's even a crust of fertilizer that's on top of the soil. So add only at the recommended rate of any fertilizer. Keep in mind that when you buy bag soil mixes, there's enough fertilizer in there to last 8 to 10 weeks. What I do to remember to fertilize is when I pot my plants in the soil, then I will calendar for 8 to 10 weeks from that time to do my next fertilizing. That's the only way I can remember it, because sometimes I pot things at different times. So I just add it in my calendar to do certain plants after 8 to 10 weeks. All right, then right plant, right place. Here's where we plug in for using native plants. It's already come up. This is a wonderful document. It's also accessible. I think these are $5 if you want a hard copy, but it's also accessible on mgnv.org, I think under resources tab. But use native plants as much as you can. Why? Because they are the host for pollinators, and pollinators are our friend. And so you want to use them as much as you can. You want to also, to make sure the right plant is in the right place, is to match your plantings in a container based on their light and water needs. So sun-loving plants should be together, shade lovers together, plants that require more or less water should be together. So what I do is try to group my pots by those cultural requirements, because it's just easier to remember and easier to care for. Microclimates, we're going to dig into a little bit more. It really is a good idea to assess them on your patios, decks, and steps, and to review what a microclimate is. It's a climate in a small specific area that is different from the climate of the surrounding area. It sounds simple, but it has a big impact. So decks have sunnier and shady spots. Some are windier, some are more vulnerable to frost. You want to see the temperature, try to get the temperature rating in those areas and take advantage of them. Same thing with south and west facing walls and all of that. You want to take advantage that east facing gets morning sun and so on. Under eaves or covered patios, that's shelter from frost. And of course, if you've got planters in your yard, or if your deck's located at the bottom of a slope or hill, remember that cold air flows downward, and that can impact your plant. So the lesson here is that understanding microclimates is a very big deal, and it can be a gardening advantage. So use it. It's not the enemy. Know your microclimates and use them to your advantage. My tomatoes grow better against the brick wall of my front yard. And I put them in pots because otherwise everything would eat them. But they grow better there because of that brick wall and the heat that radiates from it. Select veggies based on hours of sun versus shade in a location. So know the sun requirements of your vegetables. You know that tomatoes need 8 to 10 hours of sun, but also know that if you don't have that much, if you're in pots, you can move them around to capture it over time. May not be as productive, but you'll have some tomatoes. Grow veggies within realistic space constraints. Remember that some veggies need vertical spaces, some need horizontal, and some need a lot of root room. So you want to make sure that your climbing vegetables, such as beans, need support. You want to make sure that support is added in the first stages of growth so that you will not harm the roots and the fruit later. Some veggies, such as sweet potatoes, okra, winter squash, pumpkins, and tomatoes, are deep-rooted and will require very deep pots. All right, let's take a break for any questions so far.
Yep, you got several questions. So 2 people wanted to know, is it okay to put water in the saucers of the plants instead of watering, directly around the plant?
Yep, you can. The whole point is you want to let that water get to the roots. The thing about it is, though, particularly in times like we've had so much rain lately, if you have water sitting in those saucers for over 24 hours, you are taking the chance of introducing root rot to your soil and to the roots. So I've done that, and I've read it that you could do that, but you want to be careful not to let water sit too long, because that particular method can kind of backfire on you, particularly in seasonal weather where we have a lot of rain. You want to be conscious of emptying them periodically. Yeah.
Okay, we had another question about folks wanted to know if instead of using fertilizer, if they could use like compost as fertilizer. And if you can, do you put that directly on the soil? How do you use it? Do you put it directly on the soil, or do you blend it in?
Right. What I do, and I'm going to talk about this later, but it's good to know now, is I mix up the thing about it with is that I think I'm going to do that later. But anyway, the thing about it is that fertilizer will add nutrients to your soil, and compost will add both nutrients and structure to your soil. So if you are concerned about if you're using your soil over and over again, if you bought the bagged soil and it's the first time you're using it, it's ready to go. It's got 8 to 10 weeks of fertilizer in it. But if you use soil over and over again from year to year, you're going to have to do something with it. And if you do some reading about it, you'll find that when you use compost, it does both. It adds structure, to your soil so that it aerates well. It also adds nutrients to your soil. So you can do different things, but compost or manure does both. It will hit both the structure and the fertilizer. Yeah.
Okay, great. Let's see. How about there's somebody asked about when you're throwing out soil, what is there a place you can take that if you have a lot of it, or what do you do with the old soil?
Well, first of all, I'd reuse it if you have space. I keep mine. Usually, I haven't replaced soil until this year, except to use compost to enrich it. But I keep mine in aluminum trash cans. I have like 4 that I keep. And one of the big chores I have at the beginning of the spring season is I put them in a big cart, and I mix compost with them, and I do the ratio of 4 to 1, 4 parts soil, 1 part compost. But if you want to get rid of it, get rid of it. I would want to put it somewhere that it would be helpful. The only thing that you don't know, although it's probably unlikely, is if it's got any kind of disease in it. So old soil can get that issue. So if your soil looks like it has some kind of fungus crust on it or something like that, or if your plants were diseased at the time, then it needs to be sterilized before you can use it again. So I guess you could dispose of it, but I'm not sure, maybe you could put it in your yard or put it in something that wouldn't harm plants. But generally speaking, I use my old soil to put in around some decking this time, and it seems not to have bothered it at all. But the main question is whether it's diseased or not. But I would encourage people to reuse soil for a couple of years, and that way you're practicing reuse.
Does salt build up when you reuse soil?
It can. The best way to avoid salt buildup is to use a granular fertilizer. Slow release can build up the soil deposits in your around your containers. But if you add compost, this is my understanding, if you add compost and you mix it in, that does help. And I also, in using old soil, sometimes I will put in, mix in some new soil with old soil and then put compost in it. But you just have it, if your plants, the year that last time you used them, if your plants tend not to have been as productive or as bright and beautiful, probably time to replace your soil.
Okay, let's see. Is there a particular type of like mulch that you recommend for using around vegetables?
Well, what I use around vegetables is just sort of my, I've got some compost that I use, then I actually do the composting, and I will put them around, and it's not as, it's not as fine as bagged compost, but it does the job, and that does provide nutrients, helps structure, and protects it from overheating. So you could put in some kind of compost. That would be the most helpful. The mulch, I don't think it matters. I would probably myself use the wood mulch rather than leaf mulch. I found that if you use the county leaf mulch, and I'm just being frank, Arlington County leaf mulch, which is a wonderful thing. It has a lot of weed seed things in it, and you tend to get weeds in that mulch, and so it's a problem for your containers.
Okay, let's see. Can you explain the difference between mulch and compost?
Yeah, mulch is, compost is actually, like I said, compost is to help structure and fertilize, and it's already broken down, okay? When you have mulch, it's not nearly as broken down, like the wood mulch is very, very coarse, and your leaf mulch is very coarse, and sometimes the leaf mulch can be not cooked enough, and that creates some issues along with the problem. As far as nutrients are concerned, compost to me is better because it's already broken down and has the nutrients readily available, and it helps the structure of your soil very well. And I don't think mulch does necessarily have too much impact on the structure, except it's good to protect in terms of holding water in. But I'm not sure how much over time it breaks down and adds as much nutrients as you would like it to. And it depends on the plant too.
Okay, and we had another question. If you have mold, sometimes you get mold in your soil.
Right.
What would you recommend doing with that? And if you said earlier about sometimes you have to sterilize soil, yeah. Are you talking about small quantities, and how would you do? I mean, if you're talking large quantities, I think that would be a challenge.
It is. I have explored that with some people. I don't know anyone, no master gardener that I know of that has ever sterilized their own soil. And maybe some have, but I just haven't talked to them. But that's the case in fact. So that would be a hard thing to do, is to sterilize it. The fungus part, or mold, usually where I've seen mold in containers is usually on the top, okay? And all you really need to do is clean it off, and it should be no problem, because the mold on the top is a result of maybe overwatering or something with the plant. But the mold itself is you can just take a paper towel, what I've done, and just clean it off. And that's all you need. Now, if it's recurring over and over again, there's some problem that you're confronted with. And more than likely, it's the problem of overwatering.
Okay. And we had one last question about using plant food instead of fertilizer. Are they the same thing, or is there a big difference?
As far as I know, they're the same thing. The thing that you hear that fertilizer is, people call it the plant food. It's really not the plant food. The plants make their own food. What it is like vitamins. So it adds certain nutrients, like we take vitamins to enrich our health. So it's not really the food, if you understand what I mean. It makes its own food, the plant does. So it's like getting nutrient vitamins from what it needs. Yeah. So
okay.
Plant food.
Great. Let's carry on.
Fertilizer are kind of confusing, but I call it fertilizer.
All right, let's proceed.
Okay. All right. We're now into some plant selections, and these are all recommendations and tips. So we'll go through them quickly. If you have any questions about them, we can talk about it. But I highly recommend you mix edibles with ornamentals. The thing you have to be careful about is that they have the same requirements. The sun, the amount of water, location, the depth of the pot. As long as they have the same requirements, you're good to go. Many flowers are edible, like pansies, marigolds, and nasturtiums. Use that to your advantage. And if you like edibles, experiment with it if you're there, if you feel like you want to do that. One of the most popular design elements in pots is to use the thriller, filler, spiller method of design, a plant design in a pot. The thriller is usually a tall plant that's an eye catcher, your eye candy. And then filler is around that, right next to it, round mounding plants. And then your spiller is flowers that drape, or plants that drape over the side. It creates quite a dramatic effect, as you can see in the picture. Color considerations I'd like you to think about. Color tends to create a pull together look for your pots. And so if you're into design, here are a few things you can think about. First of all, you might think about how the background that your container is against might influence your colors. So I have a deck that's gray with white and black railings. And so I'm thinking about doing some changing up with not only pots, but also some plantings that might bring out that and pop against those particular colors. How about the colors that are on the outside of your home? Do you have yellow siding, green shutters, those kinds of things you can think about. My favorite with colors is plants that have beautiful, beautiful leaves, like coleus with their greens and reds and purples. So you might want to consider plant selection just for the leaves. Another thing is the colors of the the natural region around you. I live on a park, and we have a very prevalent tree canopy in our backyard, and we have a lot of limestone in the park. And so playing off of those colors is kind of a fun thing to think about as well. You might even want to choose colors of some wonderful place you visited. Like, I love Italy, and so some reason I do like lemon yellows, or the olive greens, or have basil greens or something like that. So you can do all kind of things with color. So keep those as, in terms of plant selection that you might want to use. All right, this is one of those biggest bang for your buck on veggies and herbs. If you don't have a lot of space, or if you want to just start with veggies and herbs, I've done some research on the ones you can combine for your biggest bang for your buck. And this list is economical and relatively easy to grow in containers. One author said it was the magic bullet for veggie and herb containers. So for greens, there are your choices: specialty peppers, radishes and beets, dwarf tomatoes, and there are some common herbs. And that is just a combination that you can deal with easily. It's cost effective, and you can grow in containers without too many problems. Okay. All right, groupings of veggies and herbs. Here's another tip. Make sure you match your plants in the same pot with similar needs, if we said, for space, sun, and water. For most part, you want to use 18-inch diameter or larger pots when you're grouping together. And the picture shows groupings of 3 pots. An example of compatible spacing, which is the spacing of inside the pot, is to use a tall bell pepper, leek, celery, or rosemary in the center with trailing nasturtiums, oregano, and strawberry plants on the edge. So that's compatible spacing. For compatibility on water and sun, these all 3 go together: green mix, lettuce, kale, arugula, and parsley. The groupings are, you could think of all kinds of things to do with them, but using an 18-inch diameter or large pot is to accommodate the roots. Grow by season. Here's some suggestions for spring. If you really are, in a small space, here's some suggestions for spring and early summer and fall. Paring down is an interesting method. What it means is that it's a process of planting multiple vegetables mature at different times in one container. It's a real space saver, and here's an example of a scenario. You can plant tomatoes and eggplant in the center, flanked by lettuce, pansies, and cilantro. The tomatoes and eggplant will shade the other plants, and you will then, of course, harvest the lettuce long before the tomatoes and eggplant are ready. So it's an interesting concept, but it does work. Pollination. This is really basically, if you don't have any fruit or seed development, there's pollination is not going on. No pollination, no tomatoes. And this particularly is important for people who live in high rises with balconies or an enclosed patio. It's a real challenge for pollinators. If you don't see bees or other insects in your container gardening pot, then the pollinators haven't found it. And if they haven't found it, that means the insects, birds, or mammals just haven't had the opportunity. You can do something called hand pollinate. I have never done it before, but it is an option for this problem. You pollinate in the early morning. You pollinate the anther to the stigma to fertilize it. You transfer the pollen using a small paintbrush. There are DIY videos on YouTube about hand pollination. Pollination is confirmed when, of course, a fruit grows. So if this is a problem, just be aware. If you have something that you say, my tomatoes don't have any fruit on them, well, there are all kinds of reasons for that. But if you're living on the 10th floor, it may be because the pollinators have not found your tomato plants. Okay. All right, we're getting ready to move on to actually doing a potting. So I want to review a few things with you. Some things we have talked about, thank goodness, but I do want to review a few things with you. You want to prepare your potting medium. Always you have to keep in mind the right size pot for your plant needs. So you want to prepare the medium. You want to check your medium, you want to moisten it, and you want to check it for what we call its friability. And that's when you take a little bit of soil and you squeeze it in your hand, and it has a crumbly texture, which means it's ideal for root growth and plant success. So you want to check it for its texture. That affects how it aerates, how the air and water get through the porous areas of your soil. If you have a structure or texture problem, you can add things like perlite, worm castings, or vermiculite. but you don't add fertilizer. Fertilizer does nothing for the structure or texture of your soil. To amend for fertilizer, remember the bag potting soil goes for about 8 to 10 weeks. So you won't need any added nutrients until that time. As I said earlier with the question, these are the plant's vitamins, not their food, and they directly affect the plant growth. But fertilizer does nothing for that friability, that texture. If you want to improve texture and add nutrients, as I said earlier, add compost or manure. All right, you want to prepare your container. If you're using clay pots, they should be wet before you start. The pot should be clean. You want to make sure there's a hole in there and that you put some kind of porous screen or coffee filter over the hole, prevent soil loss, thereby nutrient loss. You want to use saucers to catch runoff water, but again, you don't want to let your plants sit in standing water for over 24 hours. Large pots have several little issues, and this particular picture that you see shows container fillers. And if you've ever used those types of things like milk jugs or crushed soda cans or foam shipping materials, that you make sure to use those. They're not biodegradable. There is just a little caveat, a little warning that I have for you to consider. It is true, big pots cost more because you have to put more soil in them. However, if you put certain types of objects in to take up the room at the bottom, you want to make sure you understand something called perched water table concerns. The perched water table is water that occupies a layer of soil that's always saturated and won't drain at the bottom of the pot. It's like perched. Water isn't evenly distributed throughout a pot, so anything that obstructs that capillary wicking action inside of your pot could cause the water to pool. And with the water pools, it's going to affect your root development and can cause things like root rot. So my recommendation is, if you use filler at the bottom to save money on these large pots, then you want to make sure that you're aware of this problem that might occur with pooling of water somewhere near, because it's blocking the aeration and drainage. Okay. All right. We are ready to take a look at a demonstration of how to pot your plants. But before we do that, I want to go over a few little things to make sure that you're got it straight in your mind about what to do. All right, you want to prevent your soil from washing out the drain hole. How do you do that? Coffee filter. You can use things like landscape cloth in the bottom. There are other things you can use. Add small amount of damp potting medium. Make sure it's moist to the bottom of the pot. Third, you want to loosen the root ball. So when you flip over your pot to plant it, you want to check the roots to see if the roots are circling around the pot, because if they do, you've got to gently tease out the roots with your finger and be very, very gentle with that. All right, 4, you want to arrange your plant at the same level as it was in the original container, and you want to add the potting mix to 1 to 2 inches below the rim. This prevents mixed runoff. You want to water the container thoroughly until it flows out the bottom of the container, or you can submerge it into a bucket of water to soak from the bottom up. And finally, you want to elevate your pot to avoid blocking drainage holes if necessary. Some people don't elevate, they put in saucers, but I find that elevating the pot, putting pot feet to elevate for drainage is good, because it not only prevents root rot, it also helps with salt deposits, and your plant needs that air coming under the pot. It does help avoid some problems. Okay, Leslie, are we ready to do this video?
Yep, let's give it a try.
Good morning. we're going to do a simple demonstration of one particular technique of using container pots. And that's the technique of the thriller, filler, and spiller. So let's see what you remember. What is the first thing that you need to do before you pot your plant? Well, you're wrong. The first thing you're supposed to do is to make sure that your pot is clean and that you've moistened it before you begin to plant. So make sure that you've cleaned it out. I did that this morning, and I moistened it this morning, and it's already on some plant feed, so I'm just going to leave it there because it's pretty stable. Do you recall what you might put in the drainage hole? Because the drainage hole cannot just be without some kind of filter to keep the soil in. So I'm using just a plain coffee filter. I'm going to place it in the bottom to cover the hole. So we're doing pretty good in terms of that particular issue. So I've covered the drain hole with some kind of porous material to hold in the soil so that not as much nutrients will be lost when you water. All right, next thing is your potting mix. This morning I mixed up a concoction of regular organic potting soil and compost. And I used the ratio 4:1, 4 parts potting soil and 1 part compost. I've mixed it up, and if you recall from what we talked about, what does compost add to your potting soil? That's right, it adds both structure and fertilizer. So if you need both or want both, that's the way to go. It's not necessary that you use compost, but I have found that it's a really good idea. I've had people ask me about using potting soil over and over again from year to year. And I would say that the first year out, you may not need the compost, but the more you use soil the same from year to year, the more you need to add nutrients, because the nutrients drain out, as we've said, with the use of water. So make sure that you do add compost the second time you use your soil for sure. All right, now you want to put in the pot sort of a moistened soil so that the porosity and the water will start gathering in the soil and aerate really well. So I'm going to add a little bit of water. I'm going to mix it up, and it just needs to be moistened. It doesn't have to be, you know, sort of like baking, you know. You're cooking up a pot. A little bit more. I feel like Julia Childs, but you get it. All right. Now, we want to put a small amount of mix in the bottom of the pot, like maybe 1/4 of it, maybe 1/3, just depends on the size of the pot. And you'll notice I am using a terracotta pot, which, if you know by now, that means something that you have to be mindful of water because of its porosity. It's pretty good. This potting mix has perlite in it and some bark and some nutrients, so on. And now we're going to turn our attention to the plants that we've selected. And this is kind of an interesting combination. I went for leaves more than anything else in this because that's my favorite parts of plants quite often. This is just something called a gold edge. And I'm going to use this as my thriller, because the gold edge gets, according to your tag, 24 to 30 inches tall. Now, it says that with that height, the plant would benefit from the use of a vertical structure. And so my sweet husband built me a little trellis. I'm going to put it in there now, like that. Now, we will take this, and one of the things you have to be mindful of is the idea that you want to plant in your pot at the same level where this plant comes out of the soil. So that's what it's used to. So we'll adjust the soil as we can. All right, let me move this back just a little bit. All right. You have to be gentle when you take a plant out of a pot. And that's because you don't want to pull it by the stems and the leaves. You want to gently work it out of the container. And you'll notice the roots, it's not root bound, but you want to make sure that if there tends to be circling of the roots, that you gently tease the roots out so that they will not, so they won't struggle so much by being transplanted into the pot. All right. All right, that's about right. Okay. So there we have that. Remember, it's going to get pretty high. It'll get up to about this height. So we need that vertical structure to give it some support. All right, the next thing that I'm going to use as my filler is a dahlia. And the dahlia will get bigger, and it will provide color, but it won't necessarily fill up all the pot, and that's why I chose a smaller pot. So we'll take your dahlia. Again, it looks pretty good. And we'll kind of put it over to the side a little bit. And that's about right. And finally, I've chosen English thyme as my spiller, having a little bit of herb touch. There we go. This one looks really good. And I'm going to drape it over here to the side. Now you might be asking, why did I put this one in front and this one at the back? Well, I'm probably going to situate this so that you'll see it from kind of a side view. And this will spill out across and over. So I think that it'll work fine that way. If not, I'll just pull it out and redo it. So let's take a look at filling this up. Very gently. And keep in mind you want to fill it to, and I've got to pack it down just a little bit, but you want to fill it not all the way to the top, but 1 to 2 inches leeway from the rim so that you won't have soil spillage that will drain your nutrients even more from your pot. Now, one of the things I recommend is to put your plant labels in your pot to recall what the plant is if you struggle with that, which I do sometimes. Then after you've done that, you want to water until the water drains completely out. And notice I chose, again, not to use a saucer, but to use plant feet because I want my plant to be well drained. Think about watering, just to review. Do you water up here? No. You water down toward the roots because that's what needs it. The leaves will get their nurturing from the roots. So you want to water it thoroughly. So if you want to see the other side, we can move it around. It's on plant feet, so be careful. But you can see, if you picture this, if all goes well in the plant world, if you picture this, in 2 months' time, you're going to have your English thyme trailing all this way. The dahlias will have a little support as they become heavy with blooms. And this plant, this foliage plant, will go rising up here to give you some great effect, because the dahlias also have yellow in their blooms. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, please ask them later. Thank you. Now that you have your pot planted, you want to step back and ask yourself a few questions. How you arrange the plants depend on how you will view it. Okay, so did you arrange it based on that? If you want it to be looking, you want to look at the pot from all sides. The classic approach is to put the tall plant in the center, surrounded by shorter mounding plants, and finishing off with trailing plants along the side. If it's going to be in the front, then you put the tall at the back, then you work forward with shorter plants and then the trailing types. If you're not sure of your design, this is what I usually do anyway. Set the plants on top of the media to visualize the arrangement and adjust them as needed. How full do you want the container? Well, it depends on whether you want it to look finished or not. If you want it to look finished as soon as you're done planting, you're going to have to space the plants very tightly. And this is better done with annuals, not perennials, because perennials, if you do that, you're going to, too tightly, you're going to have to divide them pretty quickly or sooner than you would think. If you can wait, then you can just let it grow into the pot. If you want to keep track of your plants, the best thing to do is have a method. Take photos, label them, keep a journal, or tuck those plastic labels that you originally had along the edge of the pot. Care basics. Here are the last little things I want to share with you that are so significant. The most common problem with containers is applying too much or too little water. So remember what we talked about, the finger test. Use plant feeder pallets. It's important that the plants breathe. Air movement beneath a pot is very important. Soil that's heavily saturated with water from saucers can cause the air circulation to be diminished. And another thing about that is you want to make sure that it avoids some other things. Use dollies or platforms with casters. That's for portability. You can protect your pots by being able to move them to secure locations. If they're too heavy to move, you can move them easily and accommodate those plant requirements. Climbing plants, installing vertical structures, do it early so you will not damage the plants later. Allow your pots to drain through to the saucer if you've used them. This helps avoid root rot, salt buildup, and mosquitoes. The last thing is learn your insects and diseases common to your plantings and inspect them. Know your plants, what diseases can bother them, what insects need them, and inspect them often. And if at all possible, any kind of pests or foliage issues you want to hand remove. You want to avoid using pesticides and herbicides as much as possible. So try to hand remove things and only resort to pesticides and herbicides if there's absolutely no other choice. All right, overwintering, for those of you interested in this, you need to protect porous pots over the winter because of cracking. So you want to store them upside down or on their sides in a dry place. And containers left outside with hardy perennials should be wrapped in layers of bubble wrap or burlap covered with plastic. Tender perennials won't survive frost like coleus or geraniums. So you can make cuttings of those and sustain those in a sunny window over the winter. Half hardy plants, those that won't survive hard frost like dahlias or Gerber daisies, put them in a basement or garage. They need the temp to be cool because the plants need to drop their leaves and go dormant. For hardy perennials that can remain outdoors like sedums, Susans, coneflowers, you should cut those back 4 to 5 inches above the soil line once their leaves drop after the first hard frost. This is a handout that will be available to you. It's Container Gardening Best Management Practices. And Additional information on container gardening you can find at this website, the Virginia Cooperative Extension, pubs, EXT extension, VT Virginia Tech, EDU. All right, any final questions? Is everybody left?
Nope. Yeah, we got a couple final questions here. Could you list some veggies that do well in the shade in containers?
Honestly, not too many veggies do well in containers if all you have is shade. That's the whole issue with containers is if there is any available sun, then if you put your pot on casters where you can roll it around, you can capture sunlight that way. But most of the vegetables that I have investigated require some kind of sunshine during the day.
Okay, let's see. All right, so, and in your experience, which vegetables do really well in containers, and what size pots do you need for them?
Okay, it all depends on the root structure. So the first thing that you need to do is to find out some information about the plants that you're going to use. You want to know the height of them at full growth, you know, and that's on the little plant tag. Very often, very little do they put in the root depth. You want to know the root depth. For example, tomatoes. Tomatoes have deep roots. So those types of plants need very, very large containers, the largest you can possibly get, because they need the aeration, they need the water, so that roots can be extended. So first of all, you need to know your plants, their height and the depth of their roots in order to purchase the correct pot.
Okay, thank you. Are there any particular plants that you would recommend to attract or to put by bird feeders or that attract birds?
Yeah. Birds, you know, I was thinking about the birds really like kinds of plants that have fruiting on them, like berries and things like that. And you can actually grow shrubs in large enough pots. And some of the berries that they like, you can also try to grow some, if you really want the birds to eat them, different kinds of fruiting plants like blueberries and so on. But any kind of shrub that has a type of berry on it, like your winterberry reds and so on, they can, you know, you have to take care of them a little differently, but birds would be attracted to those kinds of things. I'm not sure about other types of pollinating, but that's what they're looking for as food.
Okay, and you had, on a couple of the pictures, there are rocks in the bottom. About what, is there a particular size you recommend?
Well, there was one picture that had a pot, and those weren't rocks. Those were non-biodegradable pellets. And so, like foam pellets. Rocks in the bottom, people do that to weight down the pot. But if you recall, I mentioned a problem that can occur called the perched water table. And you want to be careful about how your water wicks through your pot, and any kind of barricade to the drain hole can create pooling of water in the pot. And that the next step for that, because the water is not going anywhere but one place or so, is root rot and the death of your plants. So I would be very careful about using that kind of thing.
Okay, we have a question about somebody who says she often gets ants in her pots. Is that a bad sign?
Huh, ants in her pots. Now that's a question for the help desk for sure.
Okay, well, I put up the information on the help desk, so I'll recommend she use that.
That's a good question. I've never had ants. I've had ants in my peonies, but not ants.
Yes, yeah. Are there any perennials that you recommend for containers?
I would go with any natives, you know, and I love them all, but this is the resource for that. There are lists of perennials in here, and I have my favorites. Let me just see if I can. Shrubs. They any of these would do fine. It depends on the size of them. If they get really, really big, you're going to have to get one of those ginormous pots. But there are so many of them that could work if you accommodate the pots, accommodate them. So I would suggest to get the best information you can is to access this resource. Yep. And that way they can get all the information they need, because it has the planting requirements, etc. Everything you need is right here. Right. And if the pot is big enough, it will grow in it.
Okay. Somebody asked if you thought tiger lilies would work for the thriller aspect of a pot.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, those are beautiful. The thing I would be careful about with that is making sure whatever else you put in there is compatible with the tiger lily's need for water and sun.
Okay. And we'll do two final questions. Somebody asked about putting clay pellets in the base of the pot. Would that have the same problem as putting rocks in the bottom?
Well, the whole idea about clay is that it affects the porosity inside of your pot. Clay is thick. It would affect the drainage, I would think. I've never done anything with clay pellets, but I think they would have this, for example, you know how if you break one of your saucers of a terracotta pot, sometimes people will use the fragments to cover up the hole or put there at the hole. Right. That means kind of the same thing. The pellets, different things like that, anything that shows potential to block that drainage hole or keep the wicking of the water from to pool, then that is creating a situation inside the environment of the pot that may cause root rot. I just, it could be fine or it could not be fine. And that's the chance you take with using fillers.